Good morning, everybody. Justin Dunaway here with the Institute of Clinical Excellence. Today, I want to talk to you guys about the idea of internal context and health outcomes. Pretty interesting stuff. But first, I want a quick shout out to RJ Williams and the crew in Physical over in Las Vegas, Nevada, for hosting Total Spine Thrust Manipulation over the weekend. It was an awesome course, great group. Physical is an awesome group, and their clinic is pretty cool too. So we had an absolute blast over the weekend hanging out with RJ. And this topic kind of comes from a conversation that came up in the course. We were talking a little bit about some of the pain science stuff and some of the context, and we got into talking about how the context in which we deliver treatment has a huge effect on outcomes. And that kind of went into a discussion on, is it more about what we're doing with our hands? Is it more about what we're doing with our mouths? Is it really just a bunch of placebo? And before we can get into placebo, we've got to talk a little bit about context and how it works in relation to pain, right? So without going into a whole neuroscience discussion on the pathways of nociception and the painful experience and all that, let's just boil it down to the Louis Gifford's mature organism model, right? So we've got information coming up from our periphery to our cortex at all times. And we also have information coming in from the environment, from our eyes, from our ears, from our nose, from our mouth, from the things going on around us. And that information comes into the cortex as well. And then inside our cortex, we also have internal context, internal contextual clues, things, past memories, fears, anxieties, past experiences, past successes and failures. And all that information checks against each other to decide whether we should have we decide if the information coming up from the periphery is this dangerous, is this not dangerous, is this something that we need to protect ourselves against? If the answer is yes, when that information is checked against the external context, the stuff coming in from the environment, and the internal context, the stuff that's already bouncing around in our skull, if the information coming up from the periphery checked against that, our brain says, we need protection against that, then we create an unpleasant sensory emotional experience to drive behavior change to enhance healing or survival. That's how that stuff works in internal context and external context. But internal context is very important in that because it's part of the equation that our brain checks stuff against. So let's put that in context of pain, and then I want to move into health. So a really cool example of that, or a really cool example of how context can override the stuff around it. And this gets into a little bit of placebo talk. A really cool study that came out looking at patients with chronic back pain, and you were in one of two groups. You either got 3 weeks of over-the-counter NSAIDs 3 times a day, or you got an open-label placebo. And the way the open-label placebo works is we change the context around it. So first we said, hey, listen, this is a sugar pill. This is not real. This is not the NSAID. You are in the placebo group. But the way placebos work is if you take this pill, in the act of just taking something, the contextual clues of just taking something and seeking treatment seems to have an effect. But also when you swallow this pill and you believe that it's going to make you feel better, your brain releases chemicals that make you feel better. So when you take this pill, you're likely going to feel better. So we're feeding the brain full of external context to change the cues and change the threat mechanism. Right, so they take the pills for 3 weeks. They take the sugar pills for 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, they compare the two groups, and the open-label placebo group outperformed the actual group. And then the second thing that was really cool is they took it a step further, and then they took the actual NSAID group and gave them 3 weeks of placebo pills with the same contextual clues, and that group caught up to the original placebo group. So what we see here is the power of change in context when it relates to pain. And we know that it makes changes on a neurochemical level. Really cool stuff. But what I want to go to now is looking at it in terms of health and wellness. Because we can dive down this road of thinking, well, if everything I do is just placebo, does it really matter what I do, or am I really actually making changes and doing anything, or am I just talking to people? And what's really interesting here is when we look at it internal context and its effects on health and wellness, it seems to have huge, profound effects. So two really cool studies that I've read in the last few months that I want to highlight here for a second. The first one, when we look at the negative health consequences of a negative internal context, there was a study done by Octavia Hart called Perceived Physical Activity and Mortality. And they took a bunch of really huge data sets that were longitudinal health studies that tracked all kinds of variables. And essentially they had a sample size of around 60,000 people that got tracked for up to 20-some years. And one of the variables they looked at is perceived physical activity. Not actual, well, they looked at actual too, but perceived physical activity. So if I felt that I was exercising enough, not exercising enough, or not exercising as much as I should be compared to the general population. And when you take that variable and you control for everything else, you control for age and health status and comorbidities and socioeconomic statuses, and you control for actual physical level. So we're looking at people that move the same and look the same, and either think they move enough or think they don't move enough. If you believe that you didn't exercise enough, independent of the fact that you actually were, if you believe that you weren't exercising enough, you had 71% more likelihood to die within the study time frame, right? So perceived lack of physical activity predicted mortality, but they had the same physical activity levels and same health status. So just that internal context that I'm unhealthy and not doing enough actually has the potential to make you unhealthy and not doing enough, right? So now if we flip the script on that, so what about a positive expectation? What if we go in and preload positive internal context and look at that in terms of health? Another really cool study by Elia Crum and Ellie Langer out of Harvard. And anything that Ellie Langer has done lots of work in mindfulness and health effects of mindfulness. Really cool lines of research coming out of Langer out of Harvard. But this study is called Mindset Matters: Exercise and the Placebo Effects. And basically what they did is they had an N of around 70. And they took maids working in hotels, and there were a handful of different hotels to kind of look at like a multi-center approach. And basically they just took two groups, and in the one group, just business as usual for 4 weeks, go in and do your job. The second group, they said, hey, listen, what's really cool about your job is your job's exercise. And it's enough exercise that it actually meets the Surgeon General's recommendations for a healthy lifestyle. And here are a bunch of cool examples about how the stuff that you do every day is exercise. And that was it. They did absolutely nothing. They had that one conversation on the front end, just letting people know that the stuff they do is pretty cool because it's exercise. And then at the end of the 4 weeks, they went and they rechecked a bunch of health status variables. They looked at weight and BMI and body fat and blood pressure and some blood panel variables, and they found that if you were in the group that somebody said, hey, listen, what you're doing every day is exercise, you had significant, or you lost weight, you lost blood pressure, or your blood pressure dropped, you had a change in hip waist ratio, blood pressure dropped, body fat dropped, BMI dropped. So you had significant health changes, and the only thing that changed between group 1 and group 2 was group 1 believed they were healthy. So this is not an excuse to just not do anything and say, hey, cool, I feel healthy, so I am healthy. But what that tells us clinically is that the context in which we deliver treatment is really cool and really important for pain and really important for the things that we're doing in that session. But when we step back and think about patients' internal context on the scale of health in general, this is something that's really important for us to tease out as we're evaluating our patients. If our patients have poor perceived health and poor perceived thoughts around the stuff that they're doing, they feel like they're not doing enough, they're constantly down on themselves, these are treatment targets that we need to change because apparently they have huge health outcomes. So we've got to realize that internal context is very powerful. It can have huge implications in pain, but not just pain. Negative internal context can have huge negative outcomes on health status in general. And positive internal context, positive beliefs and expectations about your health status and activity levels can have huge and profound effects on your actual perceived or your actual health measures. So we got to step away from thinking about things like this as placebos, right? Because placebo is a dirty word. Every time we hear that, we cringe a little bit. And in general, when we think about a placebo is an inert substance. It's a thing that we can apply to a patient and not move the needle at all. And I would argue that in the whole of our research with dealing with humans, we have not yet discovered a way to interact with a biologic system as complex as a human being in an inert way. We haven't figured it out. Everything we do changes context and moves the needle forward or backwards. So instead of trying to sterilize that piece, let's identify it. Let's identify the things that are bouncing around in your patient's head when they walk in the door that may be detrimental to our outcomes, but that we can leverage, we can change those, we can get in and really encourage our patients to think differently about themselves. And just that thought, if it really sinks in, can change their health outcomes. So, today in clinic, this week in clinic, when we're dealing with our patients, when we're doing our evals, when we're talking to the people through the door, let's really drill down into our patients' beliefs and expectations. Not just about their pain, not just about what's going on and what they came to see us for, but let's really drill down deep into their beliefs about their health, about their wellness, about their activity. Let's figure out what's going on from an internal context perspective for not just pain, but health in general. And then if we identify things in there, let's work to change that. Let's work to change our patients' beliefs and expectations. If you've listened to me talk, you've heard me say it over and over again. Beliefs and expectations are the foundation that outcomes are built on. And I believe that all day long for our painful patients. But what I'm seeing in the research now is that these beliefs and expectations go far beyond our pain ratings in the clinic and are actually driving health outcomes. So let's really get in, drill down, figure out what's going on in our patients' heads, and really come alongside them, build them up from not just physical, but from an emotional resiliency standpoint as well. And let's drive health and wellness forward. Awesome. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow, and we'll see you again next time.